Hello everybody, here comes our review of tax incidence of a per unit tax. So a tax in which case government charges certain amount of money per each unit of a good bought and sold at the market. And it can impose this tax on buyers, or it can impose a tax on sellers. In other words, it can tell buyers to give this much money every time they're buying this good, or they can tell sellers to pay the tax. So basically, whoever gives government the money is the one on whom the tax is imposed. And we're going to see how tax burden is going to be distributed between buyers and sellers. And for that, we're going to use these two diagrams. As you can see, the starting diagram is exactly the same. And we do that so that we can actually compare the result of the tax on buyers and sellers. So we can compare the outcome and see how actually tax burdens look like. And basically what we're going to see is that tax burden is going to be exactly the same, no matter on whom the tax is imposed. So let's say there is a tax of $3 per unit, and it's imposed on sellers. So tax is imposed on sellers. Okay, so the first thing to do to figure out what's going on is to shift one of the curves. And because we're dealing with sellers, clearly it's going to be supply curve. How is it going to shift? Well, it's going to go up. So we need to shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax, which is, as we know, is $3. Alright, so how do we do that? You pretty much pick any 2 points on the supply curve and then move them up by $3. So given the scale, this is $1, which means 1, 2, 3 makes $3. And for this point, 1, 2, 3 also makes $3. So here we go. We got 2 points. And if we connect them, we'll get the entire curve, which is the supply curve shifted up by the amount of the tax. Next step, step number 2, is to find the new equilibrium. Equilibrium, which is pretty easy to do. It's just the point where this adjusted supply curve that reflects the tax intersects the new demand curve. And the new equilibrium price is this one, right? The one that matches this point. This is the new equilibrium quantity, which is smaller than the initial one. So let's call it PT. So new equilibrium price when the tax is imposed. And it looks like it is $9. This is 7, 8, 9. And this is QT. So here comes our new equilibrium. I think it's pretty straightforward to find it, but one important observation we need to make right away and never forget about it. The thing is that new equilibrium price is not simply the initial price plus tax, because if it was that, it would be 7 plus 3, 10. But it's not as simple as just adding tax on top of the initial equilibrium price. You need to shift the supply curve and then use this shifted supply curve to find the new equilibrium and the new equilibrium price, which is 9, which is smaller than 10, and basically it's always the case. The new equilibrium price is always smaller than tax plus the old equilibrium price. Alright, so now we're ready to talk about tax burden. So, and let's start with tax burden on buyers. Because it's actually easier, because buyers are not paying the tax, so we can figure out how much they suffer, so to speak, due to this tax fairly easily. And tax burden on buyers is measured as an increase in price, well, that buyers have to deal with. So in increase in price they are paying. So generally speaking, it's PB, price paid by buyers, minus P0, which is the initial equilibrium price. Because before the tax was imposed, the equilibrium price was what buyers were paying, sellers were getting. So P0, I think it's very easy to identify. PB, what is PB? How would we know PB? Well, PB is the same as PT in this case. Because in this new equilibrium, buyers not paying the tax, so whatever they pay to sellers based on the new equilibrium price, well, that's the end of it for them. So PB is just PT, and which is $9. And of course P0 is just $7. So tax burden on buyers, according to the formula above, is PB, which is $9, minus P0, which is $7, so $2 is tax burden on buyers. Again, measured as an increase in price that buyers have to pay in the new situation when tax is imposed compared to how much they were paying before the tax was imposed. Next step is to figure out tax burden on sellers. So tax burden on sellers, generally speaking, is measured as a decrease in price received by sellers. So that's the difference between P0, the initial equilibrium price, because it actually always, the price received by sellers always decreases. For buyers, it's all what they pay is always going up. What sellers are getting always going down. And basically the tax is squeezing in, and that's how government gets its money. So P0 minus PS, generally speaking. So the tricky part is to figure out PS. And PS is the price received by sellers. So now let's think about it. What do sellers get? We know they're actually paying the tax, but first of all, they're getting paid by buyers, right? So in fact, they get PT, the new equilibrium price. So that's what buyers are giving them. But they're not keeping this money, right? They also have to give government the tax, so per unit charge. So we need to subtract T from PT. So it's 9 minus 3, which is $6. Price received by sellers after the tax had been imposed. Right? I hope it makes sense. So finally, we're ready to calculate tax burden on sellers, which is according to this formula. This one. This one. is the difference between the initial equilibrium price, which is 7, right, and the new effective price received by sellers, which is $6. So just exactly $1. Now let's see how we can illustrate these two things on the graph. So tax burden on buyers is just this increase in price. So by the way, PT is happen to be PB, so this is what PB is, and PS PT minus T, right? So this is PT, $9 is PT, and minus tax, which is 3, takes us down if you go from this point to this point. So this is PS, right? Which also happens to be, this is PS, which also happens to be PT, this thing, right? Minus the tax, which is $3. This is how we get PS, and this is where we can see it on the diagram. So an increase in price for buyers constitutes tax burden on buyers, and decrease in price received by sellers constitutes tax burden on sellers. So for buyers it's $2, for sellers it's just $1. And another important relationship you need to remember is that tax burden on buyers plus tax burden on sellers always supposed to be equal to the tax. Okay, so to summarize and to remind you, one important thing, again, equilibrium price doesn't go up just by adding tax on top of the initial equilibrium price. And then on this diagram, PB in fact always going to be on the top. So like if you're figuring out which one is which, actually it might help to look at this triangle, because it's easy to distinguish those points. So this upper corner is always PB, the lower corner is always PS, and this corner is always P0. All right, so we're done with figuring out tax burden on buyers and sellers when tax is imposed on sellers. And actually another important thing we're noticing here is that even though tax is imposed on sellers, effectively it affects buyers quite a bit, right? In fact, tax burden on buyers is larger than tax burden on sellers. So that's one very important conclusion we can make here, and notice it, that even though tax is imposed on sellers, eventually the tax burden is distributed between both buyers and sellers. Okay, next step. Next step is to talk about distribution of tax burden when tax is imposed on buyers. So again, it's the same, exactly the same tax, $3, but now tax is imposed on buyers. So how things are going to work out in this case? Well, it's very similar to what we saw in the previous diagram. First, we need to shift the curve. But we're shifting the demand curve now, right? Because tax is imposed on buyers. The demand curve down by small t, which is $3. How do we do that? Well, similarly to the previous case, even though here we're shifting the curve down, but the technique is the same. We take 2 points on the demand curve and maybe let's take this one and go 1, 2, 3. And then 1, 2, 3. That's how we get new points on the new adjusted demand curve. And using this new adjusted demand curve, we can find the new equilibrium. So step number 2, find the new equilibrium, which happens to be right here. So PT, or equilibrium price after the tax is imposed, is $6, right? So that's the new equilibrium price, that's the new equilibrium quantity. So QT. So again, as before, we should notice that, well, in this case, actually, it's probably not even worth mentioning, because price in fact is going down. But again, still, you see, it's not going down just simply by subtracting $3 from 7. So it's not as simple as just to take the initial equilibrium price and then subtract like the tax, if we know that tax is imposed on buyers. So price will not go down as much. It will not be $4 as we just saw. It's $6. So again, it's not as simple as just subtracting tax from the initial equilibrium price. You have to shift your demand curve and then find the new equilibrium price. And you shifting the demand curve by shifting it down by $3. So this is where this $3 show up. Okay, so number 3 is figuring out tax burden on buyers and sellers. Let's start with sellers, because sellers are not paying the tax, so it's fairly straightforward. So we already know the formula, so it's P0 minus PS, right? So it's by how much price received by sellers goes down compared to where it was before the tax was imposed. So P0 is pretty clear where it is, right? Now PS. What is PS? PS is the amount of money received by sellers. And simply put, it's just PT, right? Because that's what they get. And that's it for them. They're not paying any taxes. So PS equals PT. So PS equals PT, and that means it's just $6. So tax burden on sellers, according to these numbers, is P0, which was $7, minus PS, which is the same as PT, which is 6, so it's just $1. So all set for tax burden on sellers. Next step is to figure out tax burden on buyers. Tax burden on buyers. And again, we already know the formula. It's PB, generally speaking, minus P0. So P0 is always there. So P0 is really easy to see. What is PB? What is, so how much buyers are paying now after the tax was imposed? Well, they paying the equilibrium price, right? Because that's what they have to pay to sellers. So it's PT, of course, plus the tax. So why it's plus, not minus? Well, because buyers are paying, right, to begin with. So whatever they're paying to sellers should be added up with what they're paying to the government, because in both cases these are payments that they make. Unlike in this case, we were subtracting tax, right? We were subtracting T because PT was actually the amount of money sellers were getting from buyers, and T was the amount of money they were giving away to the government. In this case, both PT and T are the amounts that buyers have to part with, so that's why this number is supposed to be added. Alright, so, and well, using this formula, or actually following this logic, because as I told you in class, it's not about formulas and remembering them, it's about understanding what's going on and writing down these formulas according to that logic. So PT is $6, right? Plus T, which is $3, so it gives us $9. Where do we find it on the diagram? Well, if you start from here, right, and then go up by 1, 2, 3, this is our PB, which is $9. And if we actually draw this straight line, we actually can see that again we're getting this sort of a nice triangle, and the upper corner of this triangle is PB. As before, PB is always on the top, and actually it happens to be exactly the same number, $9. And PS is at the bottom, just like before, like in this case. But let's get it done with tax burden on buyers. So now we know PB, so tax burden on buyers is, according to this formula, is PB, which is $9, minus P0, which is $7, so $2. Here we go. Now if we actually look at those tax burdens, we might notice that they are the same tax burdens we got in the previous case. So tax burden on buyers was $2 here, and it's $2 here as well. Tax burden on sellers was $1 here, right, and it's $1 here as well. So an amazing result we're getting here is that no matter on whom the tax is imposed, the distribution of tax burdens is actually exactly the same in both cases. So basically, tax burden, or the effect of taxation on buyers or sellers, doesn't seem to have anything to do with on whom it is imposed. So it's a really interesting result. And we'll talk about this more next time we talk about taxation. So for today, we just want to make sure we understand all this, the logic of what we were doing. So we understand how we measure tax burden and what these tax burdens are in both cases, even though again they end up being exactly the same. So I'm stopping here. Thank you for your time. I'll talk to you next time.